Claire and Ethan had always been the couple everyone admired. Married for 5 years, they had built a life many would envy. They met in college and quickly became inseparable. Ethan, with his charm and ambition, always seemed to have everything under control. To Claire, he was perfect. A caring husband, a loving partner, and a man who promised to support her through everything. She remembered their honeymoon in Italy, the way he held her hand as they walked through the old streets of Rome, how he whispered that he'd always protect her no matter what. The memory felt so real, so tangible, and yet it was all a lie. Their house was cozy, filled with laughter, and life seemed perfect. Claire felt safe in their routine, knowing that no matter what, they had each other. But little did she know, Ethan was keeping a secret so dark that it would shatter everything they built. It was an ordinary Monday when the knock on the door came, sharp and unexpected. Claire was in the middle of her usual morning routine, a cup of coffee in hand. When she opened the door, 2 detectives stood there, their expressions serious. "Mrs. Walker," one of them said, "we need to speak with you about your husband." Claire's heart raced. She tried to keep her calm, thinking it was some kind of misunderstanding. The detectives didn't waste time with pleasantries. They explained that Ethan was under investigation for illegal activities. Claire's first thought was that it had to be some kind of mistake. Ethan? A criminal? No way. But as the conversation continued, she began to realize this wasn't a misunderstanding at all. The next few days felt like a nightmare. Ethan was arrested, and Claire was left in a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. How could this be happening? She was still processing the shock when the detectives showed up to question her. They handed her the evidence, wire transfers, messages, documents, all showing that Ethan had been involved in illegal activities. The more they revealed, the clearer it became. Ethan was hiding a double life. He had been laundering money, using their family's business as a cover for his crimes. But that wasn't all. Ethan was connected to something even darker, a murder. Claire couldn't believe it. The man she had loved and trusted was involved in things she couldn't even comprehend. How had she missed all the signs? As the investigation deepened, more secrets began to surface. Ethan wasn't just involved in money laundering. He was part of a dangerous criminal syndicate. Claire's world started to unravel. She couldn't believe that the man she'd spent her life with had been lying to her every single day. And then there was Lucas, the name that kept coming up in the investigation. Lucas was someone Claire had heard about in passing, but never thought much of. Ethan had always described him as a business partner, a friend from work, but the police revealed the shocking truth. Lucas was deeply involved in the crimes Ethan was committing. Ethan and Lucas had been partners in crime, and Lucas was connected to people who weren't afraid to kill. Claire could feel the walls closing in around her. She couldn't escape the fact that the life she thought she knew was a complete lie. The trial was the hardest part. Claire had to face Ethan in the courtroom, a man she had loved and trusted, now a convicted criminal. It was painful to look at him, to see the man who had once promised to always be there for her, now sitting on the other side, cold and unrepentant. Claire sat across from Ethan in the cold, sterile visitation room. The man in front of her was a shadow of who he once was, his hollow eyes betraying nights of restless sleep. And yet, there was something in his expression that made her stomach turn. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look ashamed. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Why, Ethan?" Her voice was quiet, but unwavering. "Why did you lie to me?" Ethan leaned in, studying her before offering a slow, deliberate shrug. "Because you wanted the lie more than the truth, Claire?" His voice was eerily calm, almost amused. "You wanted the perfect husband, and I gave you one. Isn't that what love is? Giving someone what they need?" Claire felt the blood drain from her face. His words should have made her angry, should have sent her into a rage, but all she felt was cold, sinking realization. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't even trying to justify it. He genuinely believed what he was saying, and that terrified her more than anything. For so long she had searched for answers, some explanation that would make it all make sense, but there was nothing left to understand. Ethan wasn't the man she fell in love with. Maybe he never was. That version of him had been nothing more than a carefully constructed lie, one she had been so willing to believe. And as she walked away from the visitation room, she finally understood there was no saving him. The memory lingered in her mind as she sat in the courtroom, her fingers gripping the wooden stand in front of her. She had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have braced her for the way Ethan looked at her from across the room, like she was the one who had betrayed him. The questions came, brutal and unrelenting, each one exposing more of the truth. Ethan had lied to her in ways she never could have imagined. His deception wasn't reckless or impulsive. It had been meticulous, planned down to the smallest detail. And then came the moment that nearly broke her. Ethan, sitting there with that same indifferent expression, finally spoke in his own defense. But instead of remorse, instead of even the slightest acknowledgement of the destruction he had caused, he let out a quiet scoff. "If she hadn't been so naive," he said, voice dripping with arrogance, "none of this would have happened." The courtroom fell silent. Claire felt a sharp, hollow ache in her chest, but she forced herself to sit tall, refusing to let him see her break. For years, she had trusted this man, loved him, fought for him, and now, here he was, acting as if none of it mattered, as if she had been nothing more than a piece in his carefully orchestrated game. It was in that moment that Claire finally saw the truth. The man who had once promised to protect her, who had sworn to love her, was the one who had destroyed everything. And there was no coming back from that. Ethan's confession in court was chilling. He didn't admit to being sorry. He didn't even seem to care. His words were cold, as if he had no feelings for Claire whatsoever. He was still trying to justify his actions, even though he had torn apart the life they had built. Claire was left speechless. The man she had trusted so completely was now blaming her for everything that went wrong. There was no apology, no attempt to explain his actions. Just bitterness. And that hurt more than anything else. The jury convicted Ethan on all charges. He was sentenced to years in prison, but for Claire, the punishment didn't end there. The damage was done. Her heart, her trust, her whole sense of reality had been shattered. She had to move on, but she didn't know how. After the trial, the small town where they had once lived in peace became a place of whispers. People looked at Claire with pity, their eyes filled with judgment and sympathy. It wasn't easy to walk down the street without hearing murmurs behind her back. The life she had worked so hard to create was now gone. She felt completely alone. The loneliness crept in every day, and the nights were the hardest. She missed the man she thought she knew, but she also hated the person he had become. In the months that followed, Claire began therapy, trying to make sense of everything. How had she been so blind? But through the pain, Claire learned to forgive herself. Ethan's lies weren't her fault. He had carefully constructed a facade and she had fallen for it. She wasn't the one to blame for his choices. Slowly but surely, Claire began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the pain felt unbearable, but she was stronger now. She learned to trust herself again, to heal from the wounds Ethan had inflicted. Claire's journey was far from over. She had a long road ahead of her, but she wasn't going to let Ethan's betrayal define her. With time, Claire started to find joy again. She reconnected with old friends, focused on her career, and found new ways to feel alive. The scars would always be there, but Claire knew she had to move forward, and with each passing day, she became more and more certain that she would never let anyone, not even someone she loved, control her life again. Despite the progress Claire had made, the past refused to stay buried. Ethan's criminal connections were still lingering in the background, casting a long shadow over her life. She had tried to move on, but the more she looked over her shoulder, the more she realized that the people Ethan had been involved with weren't done with her yet. It started with strange phone calls late at night. Unknown numbers, no one on the other end, just eerie silence. Then came the emails, cryptic messages that seemed harmless at first, but gradually turned into more sinister threats. It was as if Ethan's past had somehow bled into her future, and Claire had no choice but to confront it. One rainy evening, when Claire was out grocery shopping, she had an unsettling encounter. As she pulled into her driveway, a car parked just a few feet behind hers, the driver didn't move, just sat there, staring at her through the rearview mirror. Claire's heart raced. She didn't recognize the car, and she certainly didn't recognize the man who was sitting inside. He watched her for a long moment before rolling down the window. "You're Claire Walker, right?" he asked, his voice calm. Almost too calm. Claire nodded cautiously, unsure whether she was about to have a normal conversation or if something far worse was about to happen. "Your husband left quite a mess behind," he continued. "People don't forget that kind of thing." The man didn't say another word. He simply drove off, leaving Claire standing there in shock. Her knees felt weak, her mind racing. Was this the beginning of something more dangerous? Ethan's past was starting to catch up with her, and Claire feared that it wasn't going to end well. The following weeks were a blur of worry and tension. Claire began looking over her shoulder at every corner, wondering who might be watching her. She considered reaching out to the police, but she knew they couldn't protect her from everyone. The situation was far from simple, and she feared it was just the beginning of a much darker chapter. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, Claire made a decision. She couldn't keep living in fear. She needed answers. She needed to understand why Ethan's past was so important to these dangerous people and why they were coming after her. Claire began her own investigation, reaching out to old acquaintances of Ethan's, even former associates of Lucas. What she found was chilling. The more Claire dug, the darker the story became. Ethan's criminal activities were far-reaching, far more than she had ever imagined. But the deeper she went, the more she uncovered about Lucas. He wasn't just an accomplice. He was the head of a much larger criminal organization. Claire's stomach churned as she pieced together the information. She realized that Ethan had been just a small pawn in a much larger game. The real power in the syndicate was Lucas, and his influence reached far beyond the local area. He had a network of people willing to do anything to protect their operations. Claire understood now that Ethan's arrest was just a small part of a much larger operation that had put her in danger. The worst part was the realization that the people involved didn't care about Ethan anymore. He was a liability to them, and now Claire was the one they were focused on. She wasn't just the wife of a criminal, she was a loose end, and loose ends were something that dangerous people didn't tolerate. It wasn't long before Claire realized that the threats weren't just idle words. They were a prelude to something far worse. One night, after Claire had gotten home from work, she found a package waiting for her on her doorstep. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Hesitantly, Claire opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside was a photograph of her, taken just hours earlier. She hadn't noticed anyone following her that day, but there it was, proof that she was being watched. And worse, the photograph was accompanied by a message written in bold, jagged handwriting. "Your husband's debt isn't paid. Neither are you." Claire froze, the words echoing in her mind. She realized now that she had become part of something far bigger than herself. These people weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. She had to find a way to protect herself. And quickly. Claire was now in real danger. What would you do in her situation? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're finding this story as gripping as we are, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Now, let's get back into it. The next day, Claire took a step she had been avoiding. She reached out to the police. She couldn't do this alone. She explained the threats, the strange man who had approached her, and the photograph. To her surprise, the officers didn't dismiss her concerns. They took her seriously. But they warned her that the situation was far more complicated than she thought. Claire didn't care. She was done being afraid. It was time to confront the people who were trying to control her life. With the police's help, Claire gathered everything she had. The threatening letters, the photos, and her own investigation into Ethan's past. They began to connect the dots between Lucas, the syndicate, and the people who had been threatening her. It was clear now that she was a target, and the truth was becoming more horrifying with each passing day. As Claire's investigation continued, the tension only grew. She knew that her safety was still at risk, and the people behind these threats wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. The deeper she went into Ethan's past, the more dangerous it became for her. But Claire was determined. She had to face her fears head-on. One fateful evening, she decided to meet with one of Ethan's former associates, a man named Tony, who had been a close friend of Lucas's. Claire arranged the meeting in a secluded area, hoping to get the final answers she needed. What happened next would change everything. Tony was different from the others Claire had met. He seemed nervous, almost regretful. As they sat down in the dimly lit room, Tony began to speak, slowly, as though weighing each word carefully. He admitted that Lucas had been pulling the strings all along, and that Ethan had been just another pawn in the larger scheme. But there was something more. Tony hinted that Ethan's betrayal had cost the syndicate more than just money. Ethan's actions had set off a chain of events that had led to violent repercussions for the group. And now, Claire was caught in the crossfire. Tony's words hit Claire like a wave. She was no longer just a grieving wife, she was someone who knew too much. Her involvement with Ethan's past had made her a target, and now she had no choice but to keep moving forward. After her meeting with Tony, Claire's mind was racing. The weight of the truth hung heavily on her shoulders. She had always known that Ethan had his secrets, but the revelation that she was now entangled in something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined was overwhelming. Lucas's grip was tightening around her, and Claire couldn't escape it. It was clear now. She was a target, not just because of Ethan's past, but because of the knowledge she had gained. She had seen too much, and that was a problem for people like Lucas and his organization. They didn't leave loose ends, and Claire was one of them. The next few days felt like a blur. Claire stayed inside as much as she could, leaving only for work and necessary errands. She had installed extra locks on her doors and windows, and she kept the blinds closed at all times. Every unfamiliar car that passed by her house sent a jolt of panic through her. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. One night, as Claire was getting ready for bed, she heard a knock on her door. It was past 10 p.m., far too late for any ordinary visitor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated at the door. Who could it be? She peered through the peephole, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing on the other side was a man she had never seen before, but his face was familiar in an unsettling way. His eyes were cold, calculating. It was as if he knew something about her, something she didn't yet know. With trembling hands, Claire opened the door just a crack, enough to speak, but not enough to let him in. "Are you Claire Walker?" the man asked, his voice low but clear. "I am," she replied cautiously, her instincts telling her to be careful. The man didn't flinch. "I've been sent by someone who's been very interested in your situation. Your husband's mess is far from over, and you'll find out soon enough that it's not just the police you need to worry about." Before Claire could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with a growing sense of dread. The man's visit left Claire rattled, but it also pushed her into action. She knew the stakes were higher now. Her life wasn't just at risk, it was being controlled by people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Claire couldn't wait around for the next visit, or worse, the next threat. The police were already investigating Lucas's network, but Claire realized that she couldn't solely rely on them. She had to take control of the situation. She reached out to some of Ethan's old associates, hoping to find out more about Lucas's plans, the syndicate's operations, and how deep the corruption went. She couldn't let herself become a pawn in their game. After weeks of sleepless nights and growing paranoia, Claire knew she had to make a choice. Either she would keep running, constantly looking over her shoulder, or she would confront Lucas and his organization head-on. The latter terrified her, but she understood that she had no other option. She made a bold decision. Claire reached out to Tony once more. She told him she wanted to meet in person, that she was done being a passive bystander in her own life. It was time for her to know everything, all of it. She needed the truth, and she was willing to risk whatever it took to get it. Tony agreed to meet her, but he was hesitant. He warned her that it wouldn't be easy. But Claire was beyond fear now. She was determined to end this, to take back her life. The day of the meeting arrived. Claire, her heart racing, drove to the location Tony had specified, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place felt eerie, desolate, and for the first time, Claire wondered if she was making a huge mistake. When she arrived, Tony was already there, pacing back and forth in front of the warehouse. As soon as he saw her, he rushed to meet her, pulling her aside before she could even step inside. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked urgently. "This is bigger than anything you realize." Claire nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I need to know the truth, Tony. I have to know why this is happening." Tony hesitated, but then led her into the darkened interior of the warehouse. It was empty, except for a few scattered crates and dust-covered furniture. The silence felt oppressive. They sat down in the far corner, and Tony began to speak, his voice strained. He revealed the extent of Lucas's operations, explaining how he had built an empire on crime, using people like Ethan as pawns to do the dirty work. But it wasn't just money that motivated Lucas. It was power, control, and the fear that came with it. Ethan was a liability, Tony explained. He got too greedy, too reckless. That's why he ended up dead. And now, Claire, you're the last person standing in his place. You know too much. Claire felt a chill creep up her spine. It was all starting to make sense now. She wasn't just a target because she was married to Ethan. She was a target because she knew about the web of crime Lucas had built. And now, Lucas wanted to make sure she wouldn't tell anyone. Just as Claire absorbed this horrifying truth, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance of the warehouse. Her heart leapt into her throat. Before she could react, a group of men appeared from the shadows, surrounding them both. It was a trap. Tony's face went pale as the men stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Claire," he whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted this for you." The leader of the group, a tall man with cold eyes, stepped forward. "You should have stayed out of this, Claire," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you're going to learn the hard way." In that moment, Claire realized that her worst fear had come true. There was no escaping Lucas's grip now. She was trapped, and unless she could find a way out, her fate was sealed. Claire's mind raced as she stared at the men who had surrounded her, each one of them a part of Lucas's inner circle. The leader's eyes were cold, unfeeling, the look of someone who had done this countless times before. He stepped forward, and Claire instinctively took a step back. "We know what you're trying to do," the leader said, his voice cold and confident. "You're trying to take us down, but that won't happen. Not tonight." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She was trapped. The warehouse door behind her was locked, and there was nowhere to run. The men advanced slowly, their intentions clear. "Please, Pleiades," Claire's voice trembled. "I just want to go home." The leader smirked, showing no sympathy. "You should have thought about that before getting involved in things that don't concern you." Just then, Claire's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her hands shaking, she pulled it out. It was a message from Tony. He had warned her earlier that things were going to get ugly, but he hadn't said how soon. He had promised to help her, but was it too late? As she glanced at the screen, the message sent a chill down her spine. "Don't trust them. They're not here to let you go. Get out now. Don't wait for me." Claire's stomach dropped. She was on her own now. Suddenly, without warning, the leader lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the dark corner of the warehouse. Claire struggled against his grip, her body screaming for release, but the man's hold was like iron. "Stop," she gasped. "I don't want this. Let me go." The man only laughed, his breath hot against her ear. Too late for that. With one swift motion, he shoved her to the ground. Claire's world spun as the men closed in, their faces a blur of malice and rage. But she didn't give up. Every ounce of fear in her became fuel for a desperate attempt to survive. She reached into her pocket, feeling the cold metal of the hidden weapon Tony had given her earlier, a small, concealed knife. As the leader stood over her, Claire's hand shot out, the knife slashing through the air. It connected with his side, and the man stumbled back, a look of surprise on his face. Blood dripped from the wound, staining the concrete floor. A scream of rage echoed through the warehouse as the leader clutched his side, but Claire wasn't finished. She scrambled to her feet, breathing heavily. The men around her hesitated, shocked by the sudden turn of events, but Claire didn't wait for them to regroup. She was already moving, darting toward the exit. With her heart racing, Claire burst toward the door, praying it wasn't locked. The handle turned under her hand and the door flew open. She didn't stop to look back. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting out alive. Claire sprinted into the night, the cold air biting at her skin as she ran. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder with every passing second. She could hear the men shouting, calling out to each other, but she pushed on, her legs burning with every stride. Her car was parked just down the street. She reached it in record time, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't care if they were right behind her now, she had to get away. As the engine roared to life, Claire slammed her foot on the gas pedal, speeding down the street. The headlights of the men's cars flashed in her rearview mirror, but Claire didn't slow down. She couldn't, she had no choice but to keep running. Running from everything she thought she knew. Running from the life she had been forced into. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Claire let herself breathe. The sound of her racing heart was drowned out by the roar of the engine as she raced toward freedom. Claire didn't stop driving until she reached a small town on the outskirts of the city. Exhausted, terrified, but alive, she parked her car at a secluded motel and checked in under a false name. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale smoke and cheap detergent. She locked the door behind her, securing every latch before collapsing onto the bed. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the night, her heart pounding with residual fear. She had survived. But the battle wasn't over yet. Lucas was still out there, and Claire knew he wouldn't stop until she was silenced. She made a vow that night. She wasn't going to let him win. She would fight, not just for herself, but for Ethan's legacy, for everything they had lost. But it wasn't going to be easy. Claire knew that the price of her survival had already been steep. How much further was she willing to go? What more would she lose before the end? Days passed, and Claire kept moving, always one step ahead of those who were after her. But just as she thought she was safe, a knock on the door of her motel room changed everything. Her heart sank as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. It was Tony, his face grim, his clothes disheveled. "They know," he said quietly, his voice filled with regret.